Leonardo DiCaprio.
Miss Anne Hathaway.
Meryl Streep, The Iron Lady.
Alan Arkin in Little Miss Sunshine.
Kevin Costner.
The King's Speech.
Birdman.
I'm Connor Rowland, and welcome back to another episode of Redoing the Oscars. And this week we're going to be looking at the year 1995, talking about the big one, the Best Picture category, and why I think maybe we should redo the Oscars and instead give it to Apollo 13 over Braveheart. But if you're new to the series, welcome. What I do every single week is pick a different major Oscar category, break it down, and talk about maybe a different winner. At the top, we talk about some historical context just to put it into frame where we were at the time. Then I talk about my alternative nominated pick, someone that was nominated in this category that I think maybe should have won. And then I also would like to talk about an alternative non-nominated pick. One of my favorite movies or performances from that year that wasn't even nominated at the Oscars, that if we were to redo it, maybe we would have also given that a nomination. Before, at the end of the video, trying to figure out, did the Academy make the right decision? Certain weeks, like last week, we looked at what I thought was one of the most egregious upsets in Oscars history in Tom Cruise not winning. But sometimes, like in the case of, I think maybe this year in this episode, the category that I'm redoing, is more up to a debate whether or not the Academy made the right or the wrong decision. Yes, we're redoing things, but ultimately the point of the show is to not criticize the Academy and say, man, they made such a bad choice, but rather to celebrate other films. And I think this year more than ever is a classic example of one movie maybe getting more appreciation in the legacy and the history of movies because it won Best Picture, and had another movie won Best Picture, maybe that movie would have gotten a little bit more appreciation, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Let me know if you think Apollo 13 is better than Braveheart. Maybe we would have gone with Sense and Sensibility or Babe. And feel free to also discuss maybe some of the other categories. Maybe you thought that the Best Supporting Actress category should have been, switched and things like that. So love to hear that stuff in the comments down below. But without further ado, let's jump into things, starting off with some of that historical context. This is the 1995 Oscars, which is the Braveheart Oscars. Now, because we're talking about Best Picture, we'll give that context a little bit later as we transition into our pick. Let's actually start on this episode with the performances. Ultimately did not decide to go with redoing any of the performances, mostly because I liked them, / I couldn't necessarily choose what an alternative pick would be. You have, in Best Supporting Actor, Kevin Spacey for The Usual Suspects, who of course is a controversial figure because of his allegations. That being said, I think that this role still holds up today. The twist at the end, which he is at the center of, is very effective, and his ability to kind of con the audience still works today. And I know that was a big movie at the time and an impactful performance at the time, so I don't necessarily begrudge the win and think it's ultimately a fine win. I actually like it a little bit better than his American Beauty win. Then you have Best Supporting Actress, which would be Mira Sorvino, and while I don't love this Woody Allen movie, it's definitely not, I would even say, a top 10 Woody Allen movie. He was just a kingmaker in the 90s, so we have to get a bit of an understanding of the context. I also don't know who I would have picked as my alternative. Maybe Kate Winslet in Sense and Sensibility, but that seems like an odd win for her. It's just not necessarily one of my favorite performances from her, even though she's good. It's just very early on in her career. I could also have gone with Kathleen Quinlan in Apollo 13, who's very good, but I didn't necessarily feel passionate about that, even though I didn't love the Supporting Actress category winner. But then the Best Lead Actor and Best Lead Actress wins, I was a fan of. Best Lead Actress went to Susan Sarandon for Dead Man Walking, which I know at the time had a lot of hype of maybe this being a potential Best Picture winner, and it kind of disappointed, I think, a lot of critics at the time. But not knowing that going into the movie, I was incredibly moved by her performance. I think it's definitely the best of her career, and is one of those performances where I've always liked Susan Sarandon, but she was always the older lady in the supporting roles. And then going back to see her work in the 90s, you really see just how much of an impactful and powerful actress she was. So that's one of my favorite surprise performances that I saw within the past, 5 or 6 years doing videos and discovering the Oscars in history. And if you haven't checked out that movie, she's absolutely fantastic in it. So I don't begrudge that win at all. I actually like it quite a bit. And then Best Lead Actor went to Nicolas Cage for Leaving Las Vegas, who's an actor I like, and I think had it not been for this movie, probably wouldn't have an Oscar. Even when he's big, I think he's still able to deliver an interesting performance, and this is one of his most emotional ones. Maybe not the one he's most well known for. That being said, it's just a situation for me where I think he's good in the movie, and I think that I'm just glad that he has an Oscar, so we'll give it to him for that. Which leaves us to the kind of Best Picture / Best Director categories, because I like to redo one of the main categories. If it's not going to be the performance categories, then it's going to be Picture and Director. So this was actually a really fascinating Oscars year, because going to the Oscars ceremony, there wasn't a clear winner. Braveheart had won SAG, Apollo 13 had won PGA and DGA, Sense and Sensibility won the Golden Globe for Best Drama, beating out both those films, as well as the BAFTA, so maybe more of the international audience was towards Sense and Sensibility. And ultimately went to Braveheart. And I teased it up at the top of the video, but I do think that this is a classic example of this show, and what I wanted to achieve with this show is how the Academy does ultimately have some influence in terms of the movie canon and things that are passed down for generations and what is told as a good movie. And I think if Braveheart was not a huge box office hit or wasn't as critically acclaimed and didn't win Best Picture, it may have ended up being a movie like The Patriot, a movie that maybe plays on TV that's well liked but is not seen as one of the great epics of the 90s. But instead it does win Best Picture, and a movie like Apollo 13 I feel like has fallen out of style a little bit. Part of it I think is because Ron Howard has this kind of boomer energy. He's kind of boring and square, and he's kind of seen of an older generation in many ways. He has a very traditional style, less showy style of filmmaking, which I actually think works well for this story, but it's not necessarily as fascinating for film fans to dissect and to talk about auteur theory and track up a career progression on to Ron Howard, because he's kind of just a little bit more of a boring filmmaker in his career, versus even someone like a Mel Gibson, who was a fascinating firecracker of an actor who became a director and has a great directing career as well. But I find his movies to be deeply personal. You can very clearly see his interpretation of life into his movies. So I think because of that, Braveheart, combined with the Best Picture win, has a greater appreciation today, more so than Apollo 13. Even though, if you ask me personally, I like Apollo 13 better. So this was the purpose of the show, to talk about a movie that, had it won Best Picture, maybe would have been more appreciated. And the fact that it lost, in a way, hurts its chances in terms of being celebrated at the end of the day. So let's jump into things. My alternative nominated pick for Best Picture is going to be Apollo 13, directed by Ron Howard. I could have maybe given it to Ron Howard for Best Director, but I figured that this movie is all about teamwork and the collective, that would feel wrong to reward just one man. Because when I think about this movie, I'm amazed at how a well-oiled machine it is. In a way, its ability to not feel personal, to not feel like it's got some puzzle piece in the history of Ron Howard's career and his personal fascinations, and the fact that he's not an auteur makes sense for this story, because at the end of the day, the story is what matters. And at the end of the day, because this is an important historical story about the space age, we needed a director that wasn't going to put themselves in it necessarily, and needed just consummate professionals at every step of the way, because that's what the movie was about. So much of the movie is not a Tom Hanks, leading star kind of castaway type of a movie. It is a true ensemble, whether it be Ed Harris or Tom Hanks, or Kevin Bacon, who I absolutely love in this movie, or just the joy of seeing some fun character actor pop up every 10 minutes and be in the movie for 10 minutes and then leaving. The whole point of the movie and the fascination of this story was that it was a collective effort. So what I love about the movie is just how much of the spirit of the actual story is interjected and it can be mirrored through the production of the film. It's a practical film in that sense, but everything works very well. Every person does their job expertly told. Ron Howard, the director, I think, like I mentioned, gets out of the way, doesn't necessarily have very showy camera work, doesn't necessarily interject any, I would say, kind of personal fascinations into the movie. It's more so just like telling this story in a docudrama way, in the best way possible. And that's why we have this ensemble of so many great actors, none of whom necessarily stand out over the others. And then you just go down to the, check off the boxes of, yes, the cinematography doesn't, take too much attention to itself. The writing feels propulsive and interesting, but doesn't take necessarily too many big swings. The editing is quick and concise, but also very clear. You have just like fascinating craft and production design. The score is great and propulsive. So you have all these little departments, right, that go on into making a film, and they're all working at their top levels, which is so much of what the story is. And I appreciate the fact of that movie, that not every movie has to be this personal diatribe of what the filmmaker and the director wants to say. And while that's fascinating, I think that can be interesting, and I like a lot of those movies, and I think part of that has to do with what we consider traditionally like an artist's point of view. This is more of a movie of the excellence of a Hollywood well-oiled story machine. How are we going to tell this story, which in this case I think is an important story, so it wouldn't necessarily feel the need to have these personal anecdotes and whatnot interjected into it. It's an important story. How do we tell this important story in the most entertaining, the clearest, and the most kind of honorable way possible? And that's what they ultimately achieve in every step of the way. So when I think about the movie, I'm just amazed at the technical grasp, but yes, also the acting, but also the ensemble, but also kind of how everything comes together. And I think the perfect example of that kind of escapism, of a sense, is the zero-G scenes. This was filmed in the 90s. CGI isn't really a thing, right? So you are amazed by the filmmaking of like, how do they do that? How do they replicate zero-G in the first, sequence that they have in space? But when we get to hour 2 and they're floating around and they're doing their maneuvers, we're not questioning how do they make this, because we're so engaged in the story. We're not drawing attention to it. We're not doing big long takes, recreating things inside of the ship. It establishes a language that they're in zero-G. You may be at the beginning amazed by how they're able to achieve that, but then later on in the movie, you're so enraptured and engaged within the emotions of the story and whether or not these men are going to get back home that you're not interested in the filmmaking. You've transcended that. You're now interested in the story. And what I feel is like such a... sometimes you have to remind yourself that like this was a real thing and that this wasn't documented, that this is a recreated movie. But everyone feels so true and honest, and someone like an Ed Harris doesn't feel like an actor. He feels like he was the actual guy. It feels like a documentary documenting it as it was happening. It feels that kind of realistic and true and honest, and that's what I like about the movie, is that its commitment to realism transcends and almost enters into a sense of what I would call escapism, in which you're totally forgotten about all the details of how you make the movie, and you're totally in service of the story. When I think about this movie, I think of just pure Hollywood well-oiled storytelling machines. And then just in terms of pure pleasure of rewatching the movie, it's all about guys who are problem solvers, and they get introduced with the problem, and then guess what? We have to figure out this problem, and a bunch of great character actors will show up and solve the problem and talk very intelligently, and it's just that for 2 hours, and guess what? It's a lot of fun. This is a very fun movie. Maybe I'm a bit of a nerd for saying that, but just for problem solving and getting people kind of introduced to the problem, figuring out a way, progressing one step at a time, the power of the human spirit, it's all there in Apollo 13, and it's a movie that I think, like I mentioned, I don't think maybe Gen Z or the younger generation has really reclaimed or appreciated, and that's the point of the show, at least, is to talk about like, hey, let's not forget about this movie. It didn't win Best Picture. It almost did, and maybe if it did, it would have had a better reputation, but it's still an excellent movie, and it was nominated, and it did almost win, because it's that one of the best films of 1995 for sure. And if you haven't checked it out or haven't seen it in a while, I think you'd be amazed at just how clean and efficient and exciting it is still all these years later. Then my alternative non-nominated pick for Best Picture, I'm going to go with Heat. Michael Mann's 1995 crime action epic saga. Just a few weeks ago, we talked about Michael Mann getting Best Director for 1999's The Insider. And even in that episode, I talked about how I loved that movie, but I don't necessarily think it's Michael Mann's best movie. It was just the only opportunity he had to actually win an Oscar. So we decided to, talk about it then. But if the Oscars are redoing things, I think they, redoing things would recognize Heat in 1995. It's a movie that is very well appreciated today amongst regular people who are catching it on TV, but also critics. I mean, the movie, it has a sequel and is coming out supposedly maybe next year, which is very exciting, but shows the still relevance of the film. And unlike someone like a Ron Howard, who lets the true life story take the forefront in Apollo 13, Michael Mann's Heat, I think, is a pure distillation of all the themes he's interested in original story, so he's able to capture that, but very much in the kind of complex male relationships, the mind of a criminal, the action filmmaking. Heat is so much of the encapsulation of, I think, he's interested in so many of his films. But like Apollo 13, there's also an intense dedication to realism and authenticity. You don't necessarily don't think that Robert De Niro doesn't know what he's talking about. You think he's a professional who's incredibly good at his job in the same way Al Pacino's character is. And I think at the time, and even still today, it's seen as like a great movie because it's one of the few times in which two of the best actors of their generation, and Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, collaborated. And some of the other instances, The Irishman and Godfather Part 2, are excellent films. And so is this, and it is put in that pantheon. And the reason why I love going back to it is the action is still very engaging and very realistic, and there's a sense of coolness and excitedness, I guess, to the film, of just watching it, of watching people talk in lingo that you don't necessarily totally understand, but sounds cool and sounds authentic, and there's a dedication to the craft and people doing their jobs very well. Like I mentioned, the realism of the action still hits today and feels impactful. But also I think there is what I could only describe as a lyrical and spiritual battle at the center of this film between these two men that are clearly almost heading towards the same place. We know that they're going to eventually meet, and you're just waiting for that to ultimately happen. And that's what I like about the movie too, that it's not just an exciting, well-entertaining, well-oiled action movie. You can watch it in the career of Mann's filmography and understand some of the elements that he's at, but you can also understand this kind of mystical or psychological connection between these two men that are almost destined for each other, that fate has kind of brought them together, that they have complicated relationships or non-existent relationships with women in their lives because they're so dedicated to their work. And it is an almost kind of what-if situation, almost like a person that was split into two, a cop and a criminal. Where could they make their choices? Because they're so similar, and yet they're against each other. And it is this kind of sad, melancholic, tonal movie that is as much a tragedy sometimes as it is an entertaining action movie. So it has this kind of what I would call samurai code heroism, dedication to a job, to a singular thing, in an abandonment of all of your personal kind of social responsibilities, and this kind of fatalistic approach between these two men that are two sides of the same coin that will meet and kind of come together. And they're coming together, while tragic and inevitable, can also be kind of, human and melancholic and perfect. So it is a movie that has more of this kind of the only way I would describe it is spiritual, almost Buddhist-esque view of like the cycle of life in it, as well as being just an entertaining action movie. But it's that second part that and that spirituality that I've always been personally very connected to, and the reason why I'm always trying to figure it out and trying to understand it, because it has this very personal element to it amongst what is just a really entertaining, exciting action movie. So love it a lot, and would have given it maybe a Best Picture nomination, and probably personally for me, probably the win too. But did the Academy make the right decision? And the answer for me is probably debatable. Yes, maybe a slight no. Like I said, my personal preference is something like Apollo 13. Someone else may have been Babe or Sense and Sensibility. It may have been Braveheart. Braveheart's an incredibly popular movie. I know Mel Gibson is a bit of a controversial figure today, but he's still an excellent filmmaker and makes, and even still people appreciate his movies, whether it be Braveheart or Apocalypto or Passion of the Christ. He makes interesting movies as a director. Hacksaw Ridge is another excellent one, and he's such a fascinating star at this time period that this is a fascinating kind of a swing that connects. And I think the fact that Ron Howard ultimately wins for A Beautiful Mind, like everyone's kind of, fine with that. And even someone like an Ang Lee wins, a couple of times as well for Best Director for Brokeback Mountain and Life of Pi. Like everyone that lost out here eventually gets their due. So maybe they didn't make the right decision in the history of things. And probably more people like Braveheart than Apollo 13, but I'd love to know in the comments down below, what's your general vibes on that in terms of what's the more popular movie, and whether or not the Academy made the right decision. I guess in the history of how they ultimately did things, yes, everyone got their Oscar at the end of the day, but looking back on things, I just have a slight preference for something like Apollo 13, and I think it would have been slightly more of an accomplishment of the film because of all the different working parts I thought working and singing in this beautiful harmony. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts. I love to hear that in the comments. I always love reading about that, so feel free to do that. And stay tuned to next week, Mondays at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to be covering the 1994 category. Should be a lot of fun. But until next time, stay tuned.